This is a cyber cafe, Sci. We're just over 8 years old now. We're 1 year old as a virtual online service, and we will certainly keep the online cafe Sci going because it's worked extraordinarily successfully. Live. Okay. Welcome to the people who've joined us for Cafe Sci. This is a cyber cafe Sci. We're just over 8 years old now. We're 1 year old as a virtual online service. And we will certainly keep the online cafe site going because it's worked extraordinarily.
I know. Close the preview tab.
Welcome to the people who joined us for Cafe Side. Oh my goodness. What am I doing, James?
Right. Okay, you've closed that tab, yes?
I think so, yeah.
This is what happens when we try to introduce new technology. But now that it's closed, you should still be live.
Okay.
Still online.
My echo to come back on. My voice sounded really funny, like Donald Duck as well. That was interesting. Okay. Welcome to Cyber Cafe Side. We are a deeply professional service who knows our technology extraordinarily well. And tonight we have Dr. Sarah Jaeger, who is a Danish postdoctoral researcher at King's College London, who studied neuroscience, which in Denmark starts differently from how we do in Britain, because they sort of start from the bottom up and understand molecular biology before they get into neurons and the brain and things. Oh, someone here says, you always sound like that. Thank you very much. Yeah, I always sound like Donald Duck. It's always shocking when you hear yourself like that, don't you? Okay, I think we've ironed out the brief technical problem there, which was to do with us switching to a different video streaming platform that gave me a strange and disconcerting echo. A couple of words about Cafe Sci. Cafe Sci is an open science initiative. It's been going for years. It runs in most of the countries in the world. There are a very large number of Cafe Sci's, and each of them is completely unique and individual. So the only connection between them is we all call ourselves Cafe Sci and occasionally sort of say hello to each other, but the way that you do it is entirely up to the individual organizer. Ours is extraordinarily informal, and that's part of it. And in fact, Sarah, who I think is quite an accomplished academic speaker, but she mentioned on Twitter that she's in equal measure excited at doing this talk and suffering from imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome looms large in academia at the moment, and it's that feeling that you really shouldn't be doing this because you're not actually very good at it. And just with Cafe Sci, I've been doing this for 8 years now, introduced dozens, maybe 100 or more Cafe Scientifics and given many talks at them myself. And I always feel incredibly nervous beforehand. I'm not sure it's imposter syndrome. I think it's more that you want it to go well and things. And once, when I was young and inexperienced, a very experienced lecturer said to me, if you don't get butterflies in your tummy, then you don't care anymore and you should stop. And so I think that's where we're going with this one. So Sarah is definitely one of our caring speakers. In case I forget to thank her at the end, our speakers are all volunteers. They don't get an honorarium for this. I wish we could. It would be great if we could send a T-shirt or a medal or something like that. But we don't because we don't have any income. And therefore, everything in here is entirely voluntary. So thanks very much, Sarah, for agreeing to talk to us. Okay. So one of the things that struck me, Sarah, was that you studied neuroscience, which means that you're very concerned with the functioning, presumably, of the human brain and how we think. But then you became very interested in the particular aspect of communication. And I was a communication scientist, but in terms of communication and information theory, I only lately got into the idea that people have to interpret that at some time. So what was it that led you from neuroscience into that specific idea of trying to communicate science to people?
Yeah, I think, I guess for many of us, there's a lot of things we can blame our childhood. And I think I can blame my parents a bit for this. I grew up on the countryside, and my parents, they never went to university, but they have always taken a big interest in my schooling, and also when I went to university, about the courses I was taking at university. So I often had to explain different like molecular theories and sort of quite difficult academic things to them. And of course, my parents are very patient and encouraging and a curious audience. So I got a lot of chances to practice this communication skill. And then I think later on, I realized that if you want to collaborate with someone or if you need some feedback on your scientific work, you really need to be able to communicate what you want to do and to get people excited about what you're doing. So I think, like, in the end, if you're not able to communicate what you know, then then you cannot use your knowledge for anything. So I think it's basically from that.
And do your parents understand what you do now? Could they explain it to someone else?
It's a little bit difficult. I would say no, they don't really understand, but they try.
Do they find it interesting?
Yeah, I think they do. And my dad is always asking how it is going, and then of course sometimes I tell him stuff about my experiments, and I did that a few weeks ago. I told him I had this very crucial experiment and I was really nervous whether it would work or not. And then 2 weeks later he calls me and he's like, "How was the experiment?" And then I have to tell him that it was terrible, but you know.
Yeah, I used to have a little rule in terms of giving a talk, that I wanted to talk in such a way that even if my mother-in-law didn't understand what I was saying, she would wish she had.
Yeah.
I haven't actually achieved it yet. It hasn't happened, but one day it might. You never know. But it's interesting because there's a sort of connection here with the Café Sci movement, because we're open science, and I suppose nowadays that's called science communication. But Café Sci is really more about a sort of social, casual talk about science, rather than a professional lecture format. Although it sometimes does veer into that. We're, extraordinarily eclectic. But when you're talking about science, are you just talking about it as one might in a sort of social setting, or are you trying to communicate the science?
It depends a lot on the situation. But I think in general, my family, also my broader family, they ask a lot of questions and they really want to understand what I'm doing. So in the end, I quite often explain my project, at least. So my neuroscience project, I end up explaining that quite a lot, quite often, I think, when we have like big family parties and stuff like this.
What do you think about the current situation? Because I find it very interesting with the pandemic and the vaccines and the messages that come across and the way scientists get co-opted into that. And I think I fully understand the reasons behind it, but it also makes me uneasy as a scientist. So here we have the AstraZeneca with the political problems, which when they were first raised in other countries, there was an element of pushback in saying, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Which wasn't entirely scientific. And now we have a slightly different situation where scientists are being reassuring. And again, I feel I understand why they're doing that, but it sort of disturbs me a little bit that a scientist should present their findings or present the facts and also try to influence someone's opinion about them. What do you think about the current situation in terms of how scientists are de facto communicating but being co-opted into almost a sort of political influence way of talking?
I think it's very difficult, and I'm also following the situation back home in Denmark, and there's some things going on now that are not, like, it's not based on science, it's just political, but it sounds like science. And then it becomes really muddy.
Yeah, we're following the science, but the science doesn't know what it is. So very often we're saying, I don't know. And it's very difficult to follow someone who says, I don't know.
Yes.
I do that in my daily life. My wife says to me, what should we do about this? And I say, I don't know. She says, you must know. No, I don't. Eventually I realized that I have to make some kind of statement of genuine opinion. I can't do my scientific, I don't know, therefore I'm not commenting on it at all. So when we talked about you doing this talk, I made up the title for it, and I gave it a title of Comic Strip Science. And to those who are watching, that's because one of the ways that Sarah has chosen to experiment with communicating science is to take academic papers and render them in a comic strip format. That's not the only way I think that she's looked at doing this, but in a way, the title was a mistake because it implied that it was like the science of Superman or how Spider-Man really works or something like that. And it isn't. It's actually a deeply serious hobby of yours, isn't it? So tell me what was the path that led you from thinking about communicating science to getting to the idea of converting deeply technical scientific papers into a comic strip?
Yeah, so back home in Denmark, I did some science communication for the general public, and I sorted out, and it was very challenging, and I learned a lot. But then when I moved to the UK, I didn't seek out this type of engagement anymore, and one of the reasons for that is this language barrier, actually, because it's difficult for me to know if a word is academic and sciencey, or if it's a word that's difficult for me, but really normal for British people. Of course, I know the difference in Danish because it's my mother tongue, but in English, it's difficult. So I haven't sought out public speaking here because I'm worried about not using the most appropriate words, basically. And then coronavirus happened, and my husband, he bought a PlayStation 5. So that meant that I had a lot of time for myself. So I needed a new hobby. And I've always enjoyed drawing. I'm not very good at it. And this is also where the imposter syndrome comes in. I can't make these beautiful drawings, but I can make the comics. So it sort of started from there, that I needed this new hobby. And from my science communication interests.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to show us what you've been doing and sort of talk us through your ideas?
Yes. So, for instance, there's this paper.
Can we just check that people can see the Sarah's slides on the screen? Somebody tell me you can. I'm looking at the chat to see someone say. Yes, okay, fine. Good, they can all see your slides. That's perfectly all right. My God, that's a scientific paper. All right.
Yes, so here we have a scientific paper. I discovered this paper via Twitter, where someone was tweeting about it. And it's about macrophages and how they behave in the skin. So this is all very scientific, and they have use a lot of fancy techniques and different mouse models and yeah, a lot of different things. Yeah, so so this paper is called Unveiling Skin Macrophage Dynamics, explains both tattoo persistence and strenuous removal. And then I took like one of their findings, like one of their stories, because they have a few stories in this paper, and I made it into a comic, which I then called Why is Your Tattoo Permanent? And then maybe we can go through the comic together. So I normally start out with this panel here, where I sort of explain the environment we are in. So here we are in the skin, where we have skin cells, also called keratinocytes, in the epidermis, and then we have macrophages in the dermis. So we have these two layers of the skin. And then this small DNA character, he is saying that every minute you shed 30,000 to 40,000 keratinocytes. So how can your tattoo be permanent, right? Because you're tattooing on the skin, and then we shed the skin. So what is going on? And that's also what's happening here. We see all the keratinocytes, they are being shedded. So it's the top layer that sheds, and then the next layer sort of move up and become the top keratinocytes. So in this way, the skin is renewed all the time.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions there.
Yeah.
So one of them is the famous, this is more a comment than a question.
Excellent.
And it says, that is brilliant.
Okay.
But that's okay, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I can live with that.
The other one is, how closely does this relate to what they explain in the scientific paper?
So in the paper, they don't talk so much about like the shedding. In the paper, they talk about why the tattoo stays where it is. So if I continue a bit, I'll point it out. Yeah. And then down here in the dermis, we have the macrophages, and their main function is to take care of foreign substances, such as bacteria and vira. They eat the foreign substance. That's what they do. And then over here, we then have a tattoo that's being made with this tattoo needle. And then I would just like to point out that this is not to scale. The tattoo needle is a lot bigger compared to the cells. But you know, it's an artistic freedom. And then the ink is placed in the dermis where we have the macrophages. And they are, of course, a little bit suspicious because this is a foreign substance. So they decide to eat it as they would do if it were a bacteria or a virus. So they do that. And then we can see here that the ink is inside the macrophage. And here we have the macrophages. They have eaten all the ink and have now a lot of ink dots inside. In the body, the cells, they get old and then they die. And this also happens to the macrophages. But the tattoo stays permanent. And it does that because when the macrophage die, then a new one will arrive. And this new macrophage will eat the old one and will then take over the ink as well. So in that way, we end up with a permanent tattoo.
Okay, a question here.
Yes.
Two questions. So one is, did you already know all the background to this, or did you garner it from reading the paper?
So from the paper, and this is also to answer the previous question, from the paper they look into this bit of the comic, so the bit with the macrophages. That is what they show in the paper, that the macrophages eat the ink, and that even when the macrophage die, a new macrophage will come and take over the place of the old dying macrophage. So that is what was in the paper. Then I had to read a little bit background about how the skin is built. So with these two layers, with the epidermis and the dermis, and a little bit about the keratinocytes. Oops. So yeah, I had to do a little bit of, I read a bit more than what was in the paper, yes. But just to get the background correctly, so this part of the drawing, you could say.
All right, and the next question is similar to that. Do you only draw cartoons of things that you specialize in and know a lot about? Or do you use them to explain things that you don't know about in order to learn and understand?
Yes, so I don't know anything about the skin. So I definitely do venture out of my my background field, or what you could say. So I do neuroscience, and the skin is definitely not neuroscience, at least not in this story. So I do use this hobby to learn about other things than things within my field. Definitely.
Okay, and a question from me: if you the paper was called "Unveiling Skin Macrophage Dynamics Explains Both Tattoo Persistence and Strenuous Removal." Is that the name of the paper?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's kind of. There is almost nothing in that tells me that this tells me why tattoos are permanent. Why do scientists write like that?
I guess it's to be as precise as possible, right? Let's go back to it.
It's kind of strange, isn't it? Okay, another more a comment than a question. I think your drawing is excellent. Oh, you're doing very well here. The comments rather than questions are good.
Yeah.
Okay. Go on.
Yes, so that was sort of the story behind this one. And I guess this was one of the first ones I did where I had like a full sort of comic. So I guess I had to learn a lot to make this comic. And my initial version of this comic was without the DNA character, so without all the explanation. So when I first showed this to my husband, he lacked some more information. So I had to come up with the DNA character. And I think in the end, he actually suggested maybe it could be a DNA thing that explains stuff. So I thought that was a great idea.
Yeah, it works very well, doesn't it? Yeah. How long does it take to produce a cartoon story?
So it varies a bit. I guess, of course, I have to read the paper, and sometimes I have to read a bit of background, but it takes quite a while. It's probably like, if I spend all my time on it, it would be 2 days or something like this.
And in that time, you've understood what the paper was saying if you hadn't done before.
Yeah. Yeah, it depends. It can be a bit longer than 2 days, yes.
Quite impressive too. Okay, another question here. Do you ever send your comics to the authors of the original paper? And if so, what do they think?
I tried with one where but I did it like only a little bit. I put it on Twitter, and then I added them to the tweet. So it was like I didn't send it to them really, right? In the end, I gained a follower. They followed me back on Twitter, so I thought that was good. But I have been thinking that I should send it to the authors, because, I mean, worst case, they think it's silly, and best case, they see it as a compliment, right? So I think I should just try to send it and see what happens. I think that's a good idea.
Did they say anything to you on Twitter, or did they just silently follow you and lurk?
Yeah, they liked the tweet and then followed me back, and that was it.
There's a terrific economy to Twitter sometimes, isn't there? Which is on the sort of brutally brusque.
Yes.
Fascinating. Okay. Do you publish these for children or adults to learn from?
So for now, it's just a hobby. I just do it for fun. But I put them on my website. Maybe I can. I put them on my website for everybody to see and also to use. If someone can use them for anything, they can just use them. Of course, I would like to know, because it would make me very happy if someone would use them.
Okay, just for reference, Sarah's Twitter handle is @thisissarahjager, spelt like her full name. And if you look on the Café Sci site, you'll see that recorded there. I'm sure she'll give you the details of how to find the website from there.
We can even write it here.
Okay.
So I have a middle name, and that's where this E comes from.
Oh, okay. I was just about to say you've made a typo. But... Are you going to do one for the Muon-G experiment with the new Fermi Lab found a new force of nature? I suppose they haven't published a paper yet, have they?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I would like to stay with like cells, I think.
That's interesting. I mean, a personal anecdote. When I spent some time at CERN, and it was interesting because my son, who's James, who runs the Cyber Cafe site for us, he was born while I was at CERN, and we bought a comic book which was produced by CERN. I don't think they'd ever done it before or after, but it was a comic book about particle physics.
Yeah, that's really cool.
To it. James wasn't old enough then to read it, but I think he's seen it since. But that was actually very accessible, because although I had gone to CERN because I was recommended by someone who was into nuclear and particle physics, I actually ended up in a computation, instrumentation and robotics group. So I really needed a comic book to explain to me what the heck was going on over there. And it was, you know, I found that incredibly accessible. So these do look absolutely beautiful, really nice. I can't believe it only takes you 2 days to draw all this.
I think it took me longer to draw this one because I also had to learn how to use the software and stuff like that. So I draw them on my computer. But now that I know a lot more about how to do that, and I also developed some habits. So now it's faster for me to do.
Do you have any feedback from taking scientific papers and converting them into this very accessible format? And it's a form that probably suits some people extraordinarily well. There may be people to whom it's inaccessible or irrelevant, or like you said, silly. But to a lot of people, this will be like, oh wow, I always wondered why, you know, why the tattoo wouldn't come off, and now I know. And they would never have got that from the paper because the title itself wouldn't have told them that it was interesting. Do you experience any kind of feedback that says, well, maybe scientific papers themselves should be written and presented differently?
I think I get some feedback where people say, like what you did now, that that maybe they wondered about this thing with tattoos, and they're happy to learn this thing about the macrophages. And I think that, like, the scientific papers, they are written for other scientists. But I think maybe in some cases it would be worth spending some time making it more accessible for the general population.
Yeah. So do you think, as scientists, in terms of publications, we've sort of shepherded ourselves into very narrow channels where we only understand each other?
Yes, definitely. And also sometimes only in subfields. Like, I cannot read all scientific papers and understand them. It needs to be somehow within my field.
Okay, and we have another question here. I was wondering if it would be possible to use comics in official presentations. Can we use comics to convey scientific findings to other scientists? And what would be the potential pros and cons of this approach?
Yes, so I've done that a bit. So it wasn't with a comic like this, but because I like to draw, I also sometimes draw my own slides for my scientific presentations. So for instance, for my introduction, I draw the slides by hand. And I think it makes it memorable. People remember because it looks different from the other slides they've seen. And then I really like it because then I can make the slide look exactly how I want it to look. So my presentation, what I say, fits perfectly with the slide. I think that's a big advantage for me when I present, that it fits together. And then, of course, I'm always, or not always, but a concern for me could be if people think it's a little bit too silly, or, and I'm not concerned about this last bit, but maybe a bit too easy to understand even. I think sometimes as a scientist, you want to come off as smart and intelligent. But I'm not so concerned about that. I just want people to understand what I mean. Yeah, but I think that could be a concern for some people, that you might not sound so amazingly intelligent.
Yeah, I can understand that. When I was a PhD student, my fellow student, there were only two of us, and Dave was my fellow student. He was more artistic. Well, he had some art in him. I have none. And we had to go to a conference and present posters. And of course, we were both working on the same project. So essentially, our posters described more or less the same work. And Dave's poster said things like, I can't remember it exactly, but it was like, what, where, who, where, why? And mine was like a scientific thing. And I remember standing there with this poster and nobody talking to me. And Dave was surrounded by people and won the prize for the best poster presentation, which was something massive, like a bottle of wine or something. And I do remember that as a seminal moment and thinking, oh, there is a better way of presenting information that's not just making it whizzy, it's actually trying to think about how you communicate. And I'm aware that I'm not very good at doing that. I mean, not in terms of visual. I can and weave a sort of meandering narrative, which is basically all I do. But in terms of this very crisp presentation where the pictures are well thought through, that you've considered every aspect of it. So when you're doing this, if you're creating this comic, do you have a storyboard first where you sketch out how the comic is going to look and the flow of the narrative, and then fill in the details? Or do you first of all draw the macrophage and get it right?
So first I write it out, actually. Like I try to write out in the first panel, I will have this. In the next panel, I will have this. And then from that, I can sometimes see that I need another panel. And sometimes I have like 3 panels and I think this is enough. And then I start drawing and then I realize this is not enough. And then I have to make some more panels. But I would start out by trying to make the best thing to do, especially when you are drawing digitally, is I think to make the boxes for each drawing, and then I make a sketch inside the box and see if I can get everything to fit in my small box, and then I sort of go from there.
Okay, so we've got 3 questions coming up here. First of all, this is really cool. Can I ask you what software you use?
Yes, I was thinking maybe I could show it if I'm lucky. We'll see how that goes. Now you can see a bit of my computer. I don't think I have anything awfully private here. So okay, I have to stop share and then I'll share again, just so you know. Share screen. All right, so I use this program, Sketchbook Pro. It's free, and it's a drawing program, and it looks like this. And when you draw in here, then it's pixelated. The other type of drawing is vector drawing, but this is pixelated, just in case someone knows anything about this. And I use a pen like this. This is like a digital pen. For me, with the computer I have, I can draw on the screen. I'll see if I can do it when I'm auto zooming. Yes.
So you draw on the tablet surface.
Exactly.
This is another question that someone asked. What drawing tools do you use? Pens, paint, software? Yeah.
You can also buy a pad if you don't have a computer where you can draw on the screen. So buying a pad is, of course, a lot cheaper. And then I think that one of the big advantages here is the button we have up here, this one, because then you start over. You can always delete if you made a mistake. You just make this again. And then over here we have layers. So if we make another layer, and then we'll just take this one, and make a little color. That. So this is now I've made like 2 squiggly lines, one on each layer. And then if I take layer 2 and I block it out, then it disappears. I can turn it on. I can also change the order. It's difficult to see, but now the other layer 1 is now on top of layer 2. So this is a big advantage. And then of course, when you do cartoons and stuff, you can end up having loads of layers. So it can get really confusing. But luckily you can change the name, so that helps a lot.
Okay, from me, in what way do you use the layers? I mean, I know what the layers are for, but do you have like a sort of narrative way of doing them? Your macrophages are always on a particular layer and then can be brought forward if you want to, or?
It's like I do I have like a layer called a background, for instance. So I try to make the background, and in the case of this one, the background would be the pink, and then the pink, and probably also the keratinocytes. It's mainly the macrophages that are the star here. So yeah, I would have a layer that's called background, and then I would have a layer called line work. So that would be all the black lines, and a layer called color. And maybe I'll have one called shadows. So you can see here the macrophage has a shadow down here. Yeah, and then I'd have on the top, I'd have a layer which are the speaking bubbles and the text.
So there's an obvious question here, and that is that you're drawing in an innately digital mode. So you're not doing a sketch on paper or paint. And is that something that you already had learned how to do? Or is that something that you learned how to do because you already had an artistic background and took on board the Sketchpad software?
I think it started because when I was drawing my slides, I drew them on paper with a like old school pen and paper, and then scanning them in, I was always unhappy with how the colors came across, how the white was not completely white, how the blue was not as blue as it was on paper. So it was this, like, I really wanted it to look good digitally. And I think the easiest way, at least for me, to make that look nice is to start out digitally.
Is the digital art completely different as a way of working from?
I think it is. It is different. It's, if you're good at drawing on paper, and you want to switch to digital, you need to be patient because it's different. Just using this one, it has a different feel compared to a pencil. It feels different with this plastic on plastic compared to pen on paper. It's definitely not the same. There's also this, like, I'm sure that everybody agrees with this by now, but it is really annoying to look at a screen all the time. So that's, of course, a downside with digital drawing, that it's just yet another screen. Right? So that's a bit annoying, but it's the pros are bigger for me than the cons, I think.
Okay, so we're back to some technical questions here. Do you imagine what your cells look like, or are they based on histology? It's interesting how we draw cartoons of neurons, for example. That must be a fellow neuroscientist, I think.
So, for instance, with the keratinocytes, they are very easily accessible with in the scientific literature. There are loads of histology pictures of the skin. So there, it's quite easy to see that the top ones are more has this shape, and then towards the bottom they become more and more big and round. And then the macrophages, I mean, they just had to look different, right? So they became this shape. So some of them are from histology, and some of them are just from my imagination, and like and limited by, you know, what I'm able to draw, basically.
So macrophages don't necessarily look like starfish with eyes and a smile.
No, I'm not sure about that. No.
It's pointed.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have another question here. I assume macrophages do not travel around in the dermis, otherwise the tattoo would change.
I think they move around a bit, but not really. Like, I think I don't have any tattoos, but it is my impression that a tattoo also, like, it becomes less, I don't know, clear. Like the lines become a bit muddy over time. And I think it's because the macrophages, they do move a bit around, but not a lot. Not these macrophages. There are other macrophages that do move around, but these ones, they do not.
Do tattoo artists know all this?
They definitely know that you have to go through the first layer of the skin. So up here, they definitely know that you go through the epidermis down to the dermis. I don't think they know about macrophages.
If they did, maybe they could do different kind of tattoos. I don't know. Okay, you've got some more slides to show us, I think.
Yes. Maybe I could show you. So this is not really a slide, but this is more about about a true artist, David Gottsell, and he makes some amazing. See if I can open this one. Some amazing art, and he has been like an inspiration to me, and I think also an inspiration to a lot of people in this field of science communication with art, basically. So let's see. So here we have some of his stuff. All of this on this website is coronavirus themed. So for instance, here we have a coronavirus particle, and this are the spike protein. And then out here we have some other molecules, and the ones in this shape are antibodies. So here we have an antibody binding to a spike protein of the coronavirus. So he does stuff like this, and he makes it with watercolor, and then he scans it in and does some processing in Adobe Illustrator, I think. But what is amazing with his work is that it's to scale. So the antibody, they have this size compared to the size of the spike protein. It's quite amazing, and it's what would you say? It's a lot more correct than what I do. Like, he has the correct proportions and everything. Yes, and I think it's very amazing.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
And then, so here's another one, also with the coronavirus. And then here it has attached to a cell and is infecting the cell down here. Yeah, and then I think maybe 6 months ago, David, he made a workshop. He announced it on Twitter, where we could work with David on our own projects. So he made like a science communication workshop where we did art. And we ended up doing very different types of things. So this is all of the art from that workshop. And it was through this workshop that I started with the cartoons. So here's another, yeah. So this is from a lot of different people. I'm just scrolling down to my cartoons. Yeah, so we did a lot of different things, and we gave each other a lot of feedback. So here are some of my first cartoons, and this is about the coronavirus. So you can see it sort of started here with the happy cells. Yeah. So this was some of my first stuff, and I learned so much from this workshop about how to communicate with the cartoons, and yeah, that was just really great. It really helped me to get started on this.
So the fact that this workshop existed, or that David Goodsall was, obviously there is an artistic science communication community, but it isn't an incredibly visible, well, it may be visible, but it certainly isn't the most common way of seeing science communication. Why is that?
No, that's true. I think that's, for some of it, for instance, with Gottsell's own work, like drawings like this, it's very beautiful. And if you know something about biology, you can also understand something from it. But if you don't know anything, it's difficult to extract any information from the art itself. And that was something I wanted to do. And to be able to do that, I needed something a bit like something cartoony, so you could spell out a story more than what he does with his very beautiful watercolor drawings.
So these are more images, whereas yours is more a visual narrative.
Yes, I think that Gottsell's is more art, basically.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. It always amazes me how much of science I'm completely unaware of. It's not necessarily the science fields, because I'd expect to be ignorant on those, but it's the way that people communicate in science. It's extraordinary, the variety of methods that there are. So are you going to go on to something else, or are you now comic strip scientist?
Yeah, I don't know. It is, it is a hobby. So as long as it's fun, I'll keep doing it, basically.
Are there other people who do comic strip science?
There is some, but it's I think I've seen one. Oh, there is definitely some with physics, as you also talked about. Also some very recent ones, like a comic books about physics. And I know there's also some about astrophysics and like the Big Bang and stuff like this. Yeah, but that's a lot more established artists, I'd say.
Okay, I think you've still got a few more slides.
Oops. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so one of my concerns about these comics was this balance between like communicating something very serious, these science results, and then doing it in this cartoon way that it looks like something for children. But then I realized that there's actually a lot of comics that communicate very serious topics. For instance, these Dino comics, which is all about mental health and stuff like that. And it's very serious topics, but it's the comic style is a bit like mine. It's also sort of simple. But this is that's a concern that keeps coming back to me. So of course I'm trying to improve my drawing technique, working with increasing the amount of depth I have in my drawings, for instance. But it's a bit difficult, but that's something I'm working on.
Okay. Have you done any cartoons about your specialist area?
So not yet, actually. I've been thinking about it, and I have the next thing I'm working on is from this paper, which is very neuroscience. This is about how antidepressant drugs might work. It's when you take antidepressant drugs, you have to take them for a few weeks before you get the full effect. And now this group of scientists have figured out why that might be. So I'm planning on trying to make a comic strip about that. But it is a little bit difficult because it's on a different level than what I normally draw. It's about a signaling molecule and a receptor that then does something to the neuron. So it's going to be, I'm going to have to work with like zooming in, and also I need to work on some panel that are just conveying time, like time is happening, stuff like this. But yeah, I'm looking forward to making this.
I've got a graphical format there in their abstract, or is that a graphical abstract?
Yes, that's a graphical abstract. And in this abstract, they are giving us a lot of information. I think I feel like they have at least 3 different stories they want to tell in this paper. And then in my comic, I'm just going to focus on one of those, because the other thing is too much. And some of it is also too geeky, I guess. It's like a lot about the structure and how it fits together. So I'm trying to focus on the most, like, the part of the story that's most interesting for people in general.
The scientific narrative is probably the most boring that there is. So that the different story types that there are, because in a scientific narrative, you sort of set out an authoritative one-way stream, as if the work proceeded without a hitch, as if you didn't make any particular mistakes. You don't focus on those. So it's like, we set out to prove this, and this is how we set out to do it, and these are the results that prove that we were right. So it's not like a classical fairy story where the hero is in a state of repose and then is challenged and is defeated and comes back and so on. But the reality of science very often is the multiple defeats, the sort of the despair, the failure, the PhD where you spend 3 years to prove that what you set out to prove cannot be proven.
Yeah.
Do you think that the comic book approach, and particularly the storyboarding to it, and some of these other methods of doing it suggest that that scientific narrative is maybe past its sell-by date?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's definitely something that we as scientists should be aware of telling new scientists. This is how it is, and it's not you, it's just science. Right? But I don't know how to relate it to the comics.
It's a sort of narrative tension in it. So if I go into a school and I go through the library, like a primary school for young children, you'll almost always see something about stories and writing because they're learning to do it. And so they will have a diagram. It's always a diagram. It's not words. And it shows like the narrative arc. So we start here, we're going to end here, we're going to go through this arc. And then they have things like the 5 pillars, which are like, 5 things you're going to think about that are part of your narrative. So it's almost as if these young children are being taught, at least in the schools that I've visited and seen, they're being taught how to tell a compelling story by making a narrative, and the narrative has an arc, whereas the scientific narrative is a straight line. And I'm interested in this idea that science somehow has kept to itself the most untrue and most dull way of telling its story. We hear the stories about people if we hear popular science programs, because then you hear about their challenges, but it doesn't permeate the actual scientific papers at all. Why is that?
I guess this is I think it's because when we write scientifically, we want to, like, we have a story we want to tell, like a point we want to prove, and that's the point of writing the article. It's not about entertaining or making people like. It's just about conveying the facts. It's not about making it entertaining or suspenseful or anything like that. I think maybe that's a part of it. I think we should definitely in science communicate about stuff that doesn't work, because if it doesn't work for me, it will probably also not work for you. So maybe you shouldn't try stuff like this. But I think it's that's another problem, basically.
So when we're trying to reassure people, and we talked earlier about the narrative, the scientific narrative about vaccines and vaccine safety, which is a sort of nuanced issue that you want to reassure. So you see a scientist or hear a scientist on the radio, and they're putting forward a sort of monolithic single view. The vaccine is safe. Let me reassure you that there's more risk of choking on your breakfast than there is of dying of a blood clot from the AstraZeneca vaccine and so on. But is that a weakness that we gain as scientists because we avoid the narrative arc with its changes? So perhaps a more nuanced way of describing vaccine safety would be to say something like, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but something like, yes, worries and worrying symptoms can be seen in all medical treatments, but we've investigated this and we've narrowed it down and we've looked at the balance of risk. And here you're not just going straight to that point that you're trying to make, which the science is doing. It is safe. And when we as scientists step outside our domain, where we're saying, this is what I set out to do, these are the results, and they support the hypothesis that I put forward. If we then step into public policy, which we always do, necessarily, if we're asked to, then are we limited by the fact that we're then not capable of following that challenge response. You know, yes, this is worrying, but if we look at all the considerations, it's maybe not, and on balance, it's like this. So that we're too straight line in our talking.
I think sometimes, at least in the media, it's difficult to be given, to as a scientist, be given the time you need to explain something that's complicated. So if you only have 3 minutes, it's really limited how much you'll be able to say. And then I can completely understand the temptation to say something very straightforward. But I agree with you that it's very dangerous. And it's also very dangerous to say the vaccines are safe, because they are not completely safe, because nothing is completely safe. But that's a difficult point to make if you have very short time.
Yeah, you could make it in a comic, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I think I'm staying away from coronavirus-related comics because I'm sick of coronavirus, and it's a hobby. So I want to do something that's making me a little bit happy, at least.
I think the first comic that you showed us just earlier did a little bit of that, didn't it? You know, I got so close to the receptor, I nearly made it through the.
Yeah, true.
That's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. Okay, we're running short of time here. You've got a slide that I want to see, which looks like yellow and blue tattoos on an arm, and you haven't shown it to us.
So I think it's this one.
Maybe you don't want to, but I just was intrigued by it. Here we are. Oh, it's not on an arm, it's the cell. Yeah. Oh,
okay,
I so see this. Is it stress that gave me my grey hair?
Yes, it is. No, it's not necessarily, but it can. So that comic comes from this paper that says all of this. Hyperactivation of sympathetic nerves drives depletion of melanocyte stem cells. So that's the scientific paper. And they use a lot of different fancy things. And then the comic starts like this. And I called it, "Does stress really give you gray hair?" And like the short version of that is yes. Yes, it does. Of course, there's other things involved, but in general, what the paper shows is that if you're stressed out, you'll have a bigger risk of getting gray hair.
Okay, I've got a question for you, and probably be my last one then. So a typical way of presenting conference proceedings is a PowerPoint. And PowerPoint has a storyboarding facility that almost nobody ever uses. That is, you can sort of lay out your story, your narrative first, and then fill in the details later. It usually supports bullet pointing and things, but so is there a sort of feedback from you looking at how to present these scientific papers in a very clear and simple to understand way into scientists who maybe don't have the same artistic ability, but using a similar sort of thinking to present their findings in a much more compelling but equally scientific way?
Yeah, and I think that is very difficult because you need to make it simple or more simple, but of course you still want to keep it accurate. So it's a difficult balance. And I think even though Twitter is really annoying, I think Twitter can also be very good at this. So because you have only a limited set of characters. So if you could, so I would suggest for people that publish scientific papers to try to make a thread on Twitter with like different tweets just in a long thread. And if you can communicate your results in that way, then I think then you made it quite far, I think. But it is difficult.
Great. We're running short of time. Is there anything that you particularly want to add to what you've said so far?
Oh, I don't know. I really enjoyed this hour. It's been great to talk about this, and then I guess I would like to say that if you have a hobby, and even though you don't think you're very good at it, I think you should just go for it, because it's very nice to do something, and for me it's very nice to do something that produces a product instead of just doing experiments in the lab that fail.
Yeah, I can see that, absolutely. And I'm going to quote someone here who's put this is more a comment than a question, and it pretty much sums up what I think. Just a comment. I think you shouldn't worry about your comics looking childish or not serious enough. They are supposed to look fun and be minimalistic. It gets the message across much easier to people, especially to people who don't have a strong scientific background. That's perfect for a cafe Sci, isn't it? Absolutely. I think you've really hit like to be about. I wish I was more artistic. By the way, our cafe Sci was hosted most recently in our art gallery. So I hope that the Lightbox Art Gallery are watching this and will invite you down to do an exhibition.
Oh, that would be so cool.
Gallery. I'll definitely put that to them. Actually, yeah, I'm serious about that.
That would be amazing. I would love to do that.
That'd be cool, wouldn't it? Yeah, and we can combine it with the astronomy one because they were going to do astronomical pictures as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Sarah Jager, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
It's been absolutely great. I want to remind people that our speakers are volunteers. They speak because they want to, because they enjoy what they're talking about and they want to communicate. And that's what we're all about here. If you're out there and you have something to say at Cafe Sci, get in touch with us. We're Cyber Cafe Sci, and you'll find us on the easiest way is on Twitter, or you can look at the website, which is cybercafe.science. And .science is the domain name, so there's no .com or .co.uk or anything following that. I'm always interested to find speakers who have a different angle and don't suffer from imposter syndrome. You know, whatever you've got to say, we can find a way of helping you to say it. Sarah, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. Everyone's been totally engaged with what you've been saying. It's brilliant, and we're looking forward to seeing your animated comics on the Netflix in the near future. And I'm closing the session right now. So thank you everyone for attending. Goodbye, have a good evening, and the recordings of this will be available on the different platforms within a few minutes. Bye for now.